blinding glare of space-age technology, it is often difficult to acknowledge the debt that today's fighter planes owe their distant cousins from the past. The Navy F-14 Tomcat is one of the most technologically advanced fighter planes in the world, possessing such an improbable mix of thunderous power and graceful agility that its very existence almost defies comprehension. Its dazzling array of systems and its potent arsenal of sophisticated weaponry make it a redoubtable opponent, capable of striking quickly and decisively. But the Tomcat, with all its marvelous electronic wizardry, did not just drop into the sky. Rather, it is the latest of a fiercely proud lineage of cat fighters dating back to before World War II. Wildcat, the thunder in the sky. Since the beginnings of aviation warfare, when planes were as fragile as tissue paper and twigs, and where pilots swooped and soared into virtually unexplored territory, military aircraft have been in a constant state of evolution. While the changes may have varied widely, the quest has always been the same: to provide an advantage, however small, to the pilots of these machines. An advantage that could often mean the difference between victory and defeat, between life and death. Throughout the course of history, wars have always been fought by young men. But time moves inexorably on and young men age, and those valiant pilots of 50 years ago are now the fathers of the sons who fight today. Two such teams of World War II pilots and their contemporary counterpart sons are Commanders Ralph and Dan McCourt and Commanders Dominic and James DiMatteo. Though separated by the distance of a generation, these brave men are forever bound together by their staunch code of honor and an unwavering sense of duty to their country.
Back when you were about 4 or 5 years old and we were walking on carrier decks, did you ever expect to be where you are now?
Well, at the time it didn't enter my mind, but as I got older, of course, it became a fact of life and a reality.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful place to be.
On the surface, so much seems to have changed.
Well, this is the F-14 cockpit here. Pretty similar to the Wildcat.
You kidding?
Yet as wildly different as the planes may be, the tactics and courage of the aviators are much the same as when warfare first took to the skies.
Well, fighters are fighters. You know, we've both been in the same mission and flown the same job, so I don't think that's changed today.
That's right. You got to have some aerodynamics. You got to have an airfoil to get some lift to carry whatever it is you're carrying.
Yeah, you still got to get a guy out there who's willing to take on the other guy across the circle. He's got to carry the ordnance to it. He's got to make it work, and you got to see the guy ultimately.
Yeah.
Overall, fighter pilot's a fighter pilot, and it doesn't really matter what your airplane is if the fighter pilot can't do his job.
That's right. You know, the man flies the machine does not fly the man.
Yeah.
During the late 1930s, when the world seemed to be a much larger place, where communication was not as instantaneous as it is today, most Americans were not overly concerned about war. In spite of Hitler's movements in Europe and Japan's war with China, another global conflict seemed unlikely. Or perhaps it was just too frightening a scenario to even contemplate. The Great Depression, too, had only begun to loosen its stranglehold on the country, and most Americans could not afford the luxury of worrying about the fates of foreign lands. Far more pressing were the battles still being waged at home, like the ones for work, like the ones for food for one's family. Europe and Asia might as well have been somewhere on the moon. But the Navy could not afford to be complacent and was busily at work with the Grumman and Brewster aircraft companies designing and testing the first generation of monoplane carrier fighters, which because of their superior speed and heavier armament had all but rendered the biplane obsolete. In 1938, the initial contract went to Brewster, but Grumman was encouraged to continue developing its F4F-2 monoplane with the promise of a limited production contract if the engine's overheating problems could be solved. The next year, when a cooler-burning 100-octane fuel became generally available, the Navy kept its promise and ordered 54 F4Fs. By today's standards, the F4F, officially designated by the Navy in 1941 as the Wildcat, is a remarkably simple machine with virtually no hydraulic systems, vacuum-operated flaps, and bicycle chain-driven landing gear that was the bane of many a Wildcat pilot. Once the plane was airborne, the pilot had to quickly switch hands on the joystick right to left so that the landing gear, all 29 reluctant revolutions, could be cranked up with his right. And if the pilot's grip on the handle somehow slipped, the crank would spin violently backward, leaving deeply bruised thighs or broken hands or wrists behind.
Landing gear, not hydraulic like yours. 29 cranks, and you better not let go of it when you're dropping the gear, because that thing come right around and break your wrist.
Smack your wrist.
Break it.
As one seasoned pilot remarked, the mechanism worked fairly well, but it seemed like it was always there lurking, just waiting for a chance to jump up and bite you. Taking off from the carriers was always a nerve-wracking experience. But landings were something else altogether. They were downright scary.
550-foot long deck.
Well,
You landed on the first third and stopped.
With the narrow width of the landing gear's wheels, the rolling deck of the carrier, and the ever-present crosswinds, each Wildcat's return to the ship was a harrowing adventure all by itself.
Sometimes this little guy got really bouncy on the flight deck, didn't it?
Sure
Remember
did.
those?
Sure did. One wing low, one wing high.
Or bounce right up into the barrier and rip a prop up, and even the flight deck occasionally.
But do you remember what you sounded like, you fellas landing on those carriers, because that was our home, and we'd have to be down there on the hangar deck, and they'd be having flight quarters, and you hear a boom, screech. The planes would land on our roof and catch the cable and make a big screech when the cable played out, hopefully.
In 1941, the lingering effects of the Depression notwithstanding, optimism in America was beginning to make a comeback. Industrial output was up, and even with the gathering war clouds over Europe and Asia, hope at last was something more than the cruel hoax it had been for far too many years. Spirits were higher. Good times seemed to be right around the corner. After Pearl Harbor, with a large part of the Pacific Fleet destroyed and U.S. manufacturing woefully ill-equipped to replace the lost ships quickly, it appeared likely that the Japanese would sweep uncontested across the Pacific, first to Hawaii, then on to their main objective, the west coast of the United States. At the time, there wasn't much that stood in Japan's way. A few ships and their squadrons of planes, that was all. Suddenly, the nation was at war. And ready or not, the Wildcat was in the thick of it, called upon to help stem the tide of a surging enemy advance. On December 8th, the Japanese attacked Wake Island, a tiny strategic speck in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Lightly defended by only a handful of Marines, the island was assumed to be easy prey for the Japanese, especially after an initial raid had destroyed 7 of the Corps' 11 Wildcats. But the unlimited resourcefulness of the ground crews kept the other 4 planes in the air, and despite overwhelming odds that were often 20 to 1, the courageous pilots in their small but sturdy Wildcats battled the invasion forces for a full 2 weeks, downing a bomber and sinking a transport ship and a destroyer before being overwhelmed on December 23rd. The price of Wake Island came high for the Japanese. The toughness of the Marines and their planes had shown the enemy just how stubborn the Americans could be. Stubborn and fierce. Before 1942, U.S. fighters had always flown in pairs of tightly bunched three-plane formations. While this tactic had worked well in the past, it was no longer effective against the faster, more maneuverable planes of the Japanese. In order for the Wildcats to survive in combat, a new strategy would have to be devised. In the middle of the night, in a deserted dining hall at North Island Naval Air Station in San Diego, Lieutenant Commander John S. Jimmy Thatch sat alone, hunched over a table full of matchsticks. As he had done so many nights before, he was busily arranging and rearranging the matchsticks into pattern after pattern, searching for a formation that would neutralize the performance advantages of the Japanese fighters. Finally, after slightly modifying a little-known tactic used in China's earlier conflict with Japan, Thatch discovered the one he knew would work. The effectiveness of this new tactic, quickly dubbed the Thatch Weave, was exceeded only by the ingenious simplicity of its design. Looking back, Wildcat pilots Commander McCord and Wingman D. Mateo remember how quickly this new maneuver was adopted.
The guys that were there at that time who were just ahead of us were the guys that talked about tactics, for example.
You're not talking about the Thatch Weave?
Well, the Thatch Weave, yeah. When the four-plane division was split into two-plane sections.
Right.
You remember how we protect each other with this kind of a...
The old Thatch Weave.
Yeah.
Cover each other's tail.
Using a looser formation of 4 planes flying in 2 sections of 2, the Wildcats, when attacked, would fly toward each other in a weaving pattern that ultimately left the trailing enemy attacker staring directly into the blazing guns of his intended quarry's partner. It was usually the last thing he would ever see. Because it was a tactic that was highly dependent on precise teamwork, one which belied the stereotypical perception of Americans as undisciplined nonconformists, the Thatch Weave soon had even the most seasoned Japanese pilots scratching their heads. American flyers were not supposed to fight like this. Considering the ultra-high-tech gadgetry of today's fighters, it would seem that the Thatch Weave would have become obsolete years ago. Nothing could be further from the truth.
We like the basic section that you guys invented in World War II. We think it's a very viable tactic. We use it today all the time, and whether it's with a mixed section or a mixed division, it doesn't matter. We like a party two to go out there and do the work.
Well, as you know, we can attribute the credit for that to Thatch because he created the idea, and it's lasted a long time.
The Thatch Weave that you guys developed, and then as later model airplanes came out, especially when we developed missiles, and we even took out the gun for, I remember in the Phantom I flew first, we took the gun out and we had a missile on the airplane. Then we developed a forward quarter missile, and guess what? We're right back to that same tactic that you guys employed, maybe a little further apart and a little faster, but we do the same thing now where we got 2 airplanes side by side, and if somebody jumps up on your tail, you turn towards each other, and just like the Thatch Weave did, we actually put a missile on a guy across the circle as he turns to shoot the guy across the circle the other way. So we've come full circle, literally, back to sort of the same tactics.
The Pacific naval air battles of 1942 were desperate engagements. Before long, blood and oil began to spill into the seas surrounding remote and previously unheard of places like Midway, Rabaul, and Guadalcanal. If there was to be any hope of stopping the Japanese, the Americans would have to seize control of these and other surrounding islands. The plans soon went into action, and there, once again, as it would be throughout the war, was the formidable F4F, the Wildcat. On February 20th, 1942, the day before a planned American surprise attack on the Japanese base at Rabaul, New Guinea, enemy scout planes spotted the carrier Lexington steaming in from the northeast. Before being intercepted and eventually shot down, the scouts managed to radio the ship's position back to Rabaul, where 2 waves of bombers were then sent out to destroy the carrier. Wildcats were scrambled. Losing the Lexington would have been a devastating blow. The carrier had to be protected at all costs. Among the pilots that day were Jimmy Thatch and expert marksman Edward Butch O'Hare. In the ensuing battle, O'Hare, for whom Chicago's bustling airport is named, became the first ace of the war, single-handedly shooting down 5 of the attackers. His solo heroics also earned him the Congressional Medal of Honor, the only carrier-based pilot to achieve such a distinction. It was only the beginning. Many more air battles were to follow. But unlike the planes encountered off of Rabaul, the Wildcats would soon have to contend with the faster and more maneuverable Mitsubishi A6M2, more commonly known as the Zero. On the ground, the Zero looked nearly perfect, long and sleek, and so light it seemed like it could fly forever. In the air, she was even better. And because the Zero had suffered virtually no casualties in Japan's war with China, and because of the destruction it had rained on Pearl Harbor, the plane was perceived to be a much better fighter than the Wildcat. But for all its speed and maneuverability, the Zero had, in reality, nothing to equal the Wildcat's thick armor plating, the heavier firepower of its armament, and vastly superior tactics.
The tactic that when they came up against the Zeros of just going down underneath the Zero, which was more maneuverable, and sucker the guy into dropping his nose and blasting the airplane. And we had self-sealing fuel cells and armor. So they just punch it full of holes, take it back to the ship, and the tin benders all night long, every night, would patch the holes. But when the Zero went under the nose of the Wildcat with those big 50 calibers, they just blew it away.
The battles between the two planes would continue throughout the war, but nowhere were they more intense than during the struggle for Guadalcanal, a small, nondescript island at the bottom of the Solomon chain. The Americans knew that if they could establish a base on this island, they could then launch a major offensive up the slot of the Solomons and into the Southwest Pacific, dangerously close to the heart of the enemy, to the shores of Japan. Wildcat pilot Joe Foss was just a young South Dakota farmer with a passion for flying when the war broke out. He joined the Marine Corps solely because he thought that would be the easiest way to get into, as he put it, a fighting outfit. He got his wish, but it wasn't easy. For much longer than Foss ever expected, the only fighting he did was to get himself out of the photo reconnaissance squadron to which he had been assigned and into a combat unit. When at last he was sent to Guadalcanal, he quickly proved that he had been right all along. He was much better at shooting planes than he ever would have been shooting pictures. His 26 victories, including 5 on October 25, 1942, are impressive all by themselves. What makes them all the more remarkable is that Guadalcanal, a hostile environment of tropical diseases, insufficient food, and a chronic lack of spare parts, was a baptism by fire. It was bad enough that most of the Wildcat pilots had virtually no combat experience. What was worse, they were going up against some of the most seasoned flyers in all the world, with no time whatsoever available for coaching. As Foss later recalled,
new pilots would arrive and expect to be mentored by a veteran. We told them not to worry. By tomorrow, you'll be a veteran.
By the middle of November 1942, thanks largely to the Wildcats and their pilots, Guadalcanal was firmly in American control. And though it was impossible to know it at the time, the spearhead of the Japanese advance had been blunted. The tide of the war was beginning to turn. Even with the Wildcat's success and the heroics of her pilots, it was obvious early on that the Navy would need a faster, more powerful plane when the U.S. began its push toward Japan. After extensive designing and testing, Grumman's F4F Wildcat was ready for production. The only problem was that with the Hellcat virtually taking over Grummann's entire plant in Bethpage, New York, an additional factory was needed to build the considerable backlog of orders for the F4F. From 1937 to 1941, the General Motors factory in Linden, New Jersey had produced a record 343,000 Buicks, Pontiacs, and Oldsmobiles. But with the start of the war, the plant abruptly came to a halt. It bordered on the ridiculous, an automobile factory with not a single tool nor one shred of experience building planes, suddenly being called upon to mass-produce fighter planes and dive bombers with tolerances and specifications far more exacting than those required of cars. And to make the situation even more absurd, the first FM-1 Wildcat was due for acceptance by the Navy at the end of October in 1942, a scant 8 months from the initial signing of the contracts. Nonetheless, despite the overwhelming odds against success, the Eastern Aircraft Division of General Motors was born. The goal was audacious, even crazy, but the fledgling company remained undaunted and set about its task with a steely resolve and an ironclad commitment to make its planes nothing but the best. After all, with the precious cargo their FM-1 fighters would be carrying, nothing but the best would do. Incredibly, the entire plant was essentially demolished and retooled within months. Workers from all over the country and from every walk of life were trained and retrained. In the end, despite an impossible schedule and the constant stream of the battlefield-demanded engineering changes, the first FM-1 Wildcat, built entirely by hand, rolled out before thousands of proud Eastern aircraft workers for its initial test flights in August 1942. A year earlier, none of Eastern's employees had known a thing about manufacturing planes. Now, standing together as one, they cheered enthusiastically as their very own Wildcat passed test after test without a hitch. Amazingly, the first Eastern aircraft, FM-1, was turned over to the Navy a full month ahead of schedule. And by year's end, 23 planes, 14 above what had been ordered, were accepted into service. It didn't seem to matter where the planes were built. Both Grumman and EAD employees from top to bottom approached their jobs with a profound sense of teamwork and an unshakable commitment to quality. Build it simple, build it strong was not just some empty slogan, it was a strictly followed creed.
And those Grumman airplanes sure knew how to take a punishment.
That's true.
Blasted, they could really get beat up and still make it back home.
I can remember any one of a lot of landings that told me that airplane would never fly again, but somehow it didn't bother them at all.
That's right.
Just
Built by
phenomenal.
Grumann, you
Built
can be
by
sure
Grumann,
it's going to
that's
get you
right.
home.
Young women such as bookkeeper Helen Reese, filling those positions vacated by male workers who had gone off to fight, typified the spirit of unity so prevalent among all who contributed so much to the war effort at home.
When I worked for Grumann for 3.5 years during the war, every time they would test fly the planes above the plant, it sounded so good. I became an inspector who was in charge of the replacement parts for the Wildcat. Grumann taught me how to rivet and make angles and all about the parts of the airplanes. We were always getting awards for putting airplanes out fast, and that made us very proud.
Men and women of the Grumann Aircraft Engineering Corporation. Today, you have the honor of receiving the Navy E. It is a simple honor, yet one most highly prized by the Navy.
We all worked hard then, but of course we didn't mind. It was all for such a good cause, for those boys who flew the planes.
Once the planes left Bethpage or Linden, they were dispatched to every part of the globe, wherever they were needed. But for the most part, they toiled tirelessly in the Western Pacific, and not only in the more widely publicized and more glamorous role of fighter plane. Wildcats also performed yeoman's duty as gunnery spotters and as ground troop support. One such squadron, VOC-1, under the command of William F. Bush Bringle, logged nearly 13,000 combat hours and compiled 20 victories during its various assignments in Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific. a rare feat for a unit dedicated to gunfire spotting. 50 years later, Admiral Bringle still remembers.
Our mission was to spot naval gunfire, and the Marines had a very elaborate rolling gunfire, naval gunfire on the beaches before they went into the beach. We had been briefed very thoroughly on this. Our planes, the FM-2, were armed with rockets and full ammunition. And we went over and reported to the battleships and the cruisers as a spotter, and they either assigned us targets if that were troubling them with the shore fire control party, or we would seek out the targets and have them fire at those targets. We also knew where the front lines were, so we didn't go too close to the front lines. Let's say we were a very close-knit squadron, and we had all had quite a bit of training in the Corsair and the F6F before we left Pearl Harbor in the FM-2. We flew on the way out, and we found out that we were going to be involved in the invasion of the Philippines and Lingayen Gulf. Spotting missions were our primary mission in this squadron.
It may not have been as flashy. In fact, it was often dull, monotonous work. But to those soldiers on the ground, the ones locked in the heat of battle, those wildcats up above must have seemed like angels sent from heaven.
The rest of it was just what we had been doing over in southern France, a long-range recce up in northern parts of the Philippines, and trying to find troop convoys and trucks. We did more ground support work, long-range recce against the Japanese. We saw a few airplanes. We shot down, I think, only about 5 or 6 airplanes during that operation.
Well before the Wildcat's final kill off the coast of Japan in 1945, Grumman's F6F Hellcat had long since replaced it as the Navy's primary fighter. But with the F4F came the beginning of an era, the start of a long and proud lineage of ferocious feline fighters, planes like the FM-2 that in the capable hands of an experienced pilot like Bush Bringle could keep on flying even when severely damaged.
Well, this time at Okinawa, we were well acquainted with the Wildcat, like the one just behind me here, and it was a good, dependable aircraft. We went out at one time with the Marcus Holland. I took 8 planes out, and I thought, well, we can really tear it up over there with 8 planes, 8 FM-2s, and we were very confident, and so we took bombs, rockets, and straight. Well, on the first run in, I think it was about as heavy an aircraft fired I've seen even since we were over in southern France. So the next run we were coming in, I told number 4, I said, you take the lead, and I'll take your position. And so he'd already been picking up a lot of flak. So we went in, and he went into the dive, and all the flak hit me, and the FM-2 was a very durable little airplane, but she really got hit right in the engine, and I couldn't tell that she was flying all right, but the engine stopped completely. Didn't freeze up, just a little wind belling. I jettisoned the canopy, and just about as I was getting ready to make the water landing, the engine started to ticking over again. The throttle was all had been hit, and the RPMs were low RPMs, and the manifold was maximum manifold. But we went on back to the ship, and I had plenty of time to think about it, what I was going to do, and I tried a few things. I could either make a water landing, I could bail out, or I thought, well, why not try to get aboard the ship? Tried the landing, a little higher approach than normal, and sort of the approaches we make today, as a matter of fact, with the jets. And got aboard the airplane, sat on deck, and everything dumped out, and there wasn't anything left. There was zero, I guess oil or anything else. But anyway, the airplane was full, and I was aboard.
After the Hellcat, there was the Tiger Cat, Then came the Bearcat, then the Panther and the Cougar, followed by the Jaguar and the Tiger, eventually evolving into today's modern marvel, the F-14 Tomcat. Man's hunger for that which is new has always been insatiable. Regrettably, the past is all too hastily dispatched to the musty attic of memory, left there to languish among the cobwebs of history. When the wolves of war came howling at the very doorstep of America, an improbable-looking hero, a stubby little airplane disparagingly described as a beer barrel on a roller skate with a plank stuck through the middle, came eagerly forward to do its duty. It was often maligned and bore the brunt of much criticism and doubt. But in the end, the carping didn't much matter. What counted most was one plain and simple fact. The Wildcat was all the nation had. What would the country have done without it? Peering back through the dim haze of history, it is impossible not to agree with New York Times war correspondent Foster Haley's assessment of this scrappy and tenacious fighter, the Grumann F4F, the Wildcat.
The Grumann Wildcat. It is no exaggeration to say did more than any single instrument of war to save the day for the United States in the Pacific.
And as ace pilot Joe Foss so vividly remembers,
I don't know about others, but the Wildcat was the best plane in combat. It always took great care of me and my boys.